Welcome to Wine Talks with Paul K. And we are Zooming today. We have a great conversation coming up for our listeners. Wine Talks, of course, is available on all your favorite podcasts, Hangouts, Google Play, Apple Play, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Pandora, you name it, we are there. And sponsored by the Original Wine of the Month Club, now sporting the Pure Wine series where you get biodynamic and organic wines sent to your door. But I'm not sure. This is going to be a ton of fun. We have so much to cover. We're here with Tilar, is it Mazzeo or Mazzeo?
Mazzeo.
Mazzeo, great. Yeah, that's not even close. Tilar Mazzeo. And I only got introduced to you because I think Amazon recommended the book, The Hotel at Place Vendome, to me. Not sure why. I haven't really researched or looked for something like that, but so happy they did because I wanted to put you on the show for the book, and then I find out you're in the wine business, which is fascinating. So welcome to the show.
Thanks.
So I'm going to read right from the Wikipedia intro, make my job easier. It says, Tilar Mazzeo is the cultural historian, American wine writer, and author of several best-selling works of narrative nonfiction. She was the Clara C. Piper Associate Professor of English at the Colby College in Maine from 2004 to 2019. And she's currently the professeur associé à le département de littérature à langue du monde at the university. It's half English and half French. So
welcome to Quebec.
Welcome to Quebec, right? So I want to just tell the listeners, I was reading this book called The Hotel on Place Vendome and was absolutely fascinated, not only from the subject matter, but the ability to really put you in the place when this was happening. And it's about the occupation of Paris and the liberation of Paris during the war. But then I find out that you had written a book that's relative to the wine business. Tell me about the Widow Clicquot.
Yeah, that's actually where I started with narrative nonfiction. So mostly women's biography is what I work on. And that was the story of Barbe Nicole Ponsardin Clicquot, who founded Widow Clicquot Champagne, which we all know from the non-brut, the orange label. Mm-hmm. And that was one of those stories that just started with a love of champagne and some girlfriends. That was our favorite champagne. And I made a joke one day that someday I was going to write the biography, and I had a girlfriend challenge me to do it. So that was kind of how it all began.
But prior, at that time you were teaching still?
I was teaching at the University of Wisconsin. Yeah, I had just come out of a job at Oregon State where I got really involved in the wine industry early on when living in the Willamette Valley, and then ended up moving to a position in Wisconsin where there's not quite such a good wine growing community. Lots of good beer, but not a lot of wine. So threw myself into French champagne as a project at that point.
Well, actually, I just interviewed a winemaker. His name is Thane Knudsen, and his history is, I'm like, so, when did you figure this out, that this wine thing was so great? He said, well, I was a student at Oklahoma University. I'm like, Oklahoma? Because, they have Concord grape wines, and you're in Wisconsin where, it's mostly fruit-based stuff. The word social or cultural historian, that caught me when I read this in the Wikipedia paragraph, a cultural historian. So, and I can see that with the book, the Hotel on Place Vendome, because, and I think I brought this up when we spoke last time. If I read a history book that said something like, yes, Paris was occupied in 1944, and then they were liberated 4 years later, and that was the end of that. That's the end of the whole paragraph. Mm-hmm. And then you just on the social side, and just at the Ritz Hotel, you tell this whole story. Is that what a cultural historian would be or is?
Yeah, exactly. So, so the idea of, especially the Ritz book, the Hotel in Place Vendome, the idea there was, we always read these amazing stories about Paris and about, the German occupation and about the liberation. But usually those stories have these very, very limited scope, right? 2 or 3 characters engaged in, what is typically a life or death struggle, right? That was that time, that place. And what I was interested in is the Ritz Hotel remained open during the war. And what would it have been like to have understood the experience of the Second World War in German-occupied Paris through the lens of all of the different people who came and went through the public space of a hotel? So, not only Hermann Goering, who was there, and Coco Chanel and Ernest Hemingway at the Liberation, but also, who's the bar, the bartender was in the Resistance, or the woman who was the, B starlet who was married to the hotel director, right? There's some
Right.
amazing stories about the employees as well and their relationship with those people who came through.
Well, I have to tell you that tomorrow night we're going to dinner in Orange County here, in a very well-known a doctor, young lady, old friend of the family's, my wife's family. But I asked last night with our friends, I said, who do you think her favorite designer is? And they said Chanel. And I said, how do I weave into the conversation that she was a prostitute when she was a young girl? and then the word that you use, which is so fascinating, horizontal collaboration, just a wonderful description of the whole time. But I was thinking about this too, reading the book. If you go to Paris, you can go on the Hemingway walking tour, right? You can stop at all the places he lived and hung out with Gertrude Stein or whatever. Do they have a hotel at Place Vendome, tour? Because there's room numbers mentioned in the book, and there's places hidden behind doors and hallways and things. Do they have that yet?
No, I don't think they do have that. It would be fun if they did, right? I mean, all of the places that I describe in the hotel are there, and I know that when they did the renovation, because they only finished a complete
Recently.
renovation, they found some really interesting historical things that even they hadn't known were there. So it would be great if somebody's there to go check it out and, follow up on the podcast and let us know what kinds of things came up in the renovations.
Well, we're going to be there, not in not too distant future. It's one place we do go every time we are in Paris. I think this time I'll stay there and start crawling around and peeking behind the doors this time. We're usually around the corner. I think I mentioned to you on the email, there's a great restaurant right up the street called Pascade that we go to all the time. So what's fascinating about the book, and we're going to start talking about wine, but what's fascinating about the book, and I think probably your style, is besides the granularity and the being able to place you in the location, is how you got to that information. How did you dig so deep that you found such archival information that you're able to describe the personalities, the relationships, the intertwining of the relationships and the personality? Where do you find these things, and how much time does it take to do?
Takes a lot of time. I mean, in some ways, the most creative part of the process is the research, coming up with that. So for the Hotel en Place Vendôme, there is one of the main characters is a woman named Blanche Ozello, and she's the bee starlet that I mentioned. Well, her family, the Marx family, are based in the States. I was able actually to locate some of her nephews and then her family and talk to them, and that was really helpful. The other place, a lot of it, I mean, one of the things people always warn you when you're writing about the German period is in France. You have to be very careful because everybody claims they were in the resistance. And so what I find is that the German police files are some of the most accurate and detailed places to look for that information. Because if you were in the German police files suspected of being in the resistance, you probably were in the resistance, or at very least, you might as well have been in the resistance because you were going to pay the price for being in it anyhow. So I was able to find the records related to the Ritz Hotel in the Foreign Office files in Berlin. And a lot of the information, a huge amount, came out of the surveillance files that the Germans kept that fortunately weren't destroyed for that.
So I don't know, was it classified? You would think, or maybe not, maybe it's completely declassified. Anything that had to do with the Nazi regime and the Third Reich would have been protected at some point, or at the risk of even embarrassment, not disclosed. But was any of it hidden, or was it pretty much available?
Yeah, no, I mean, lots of things went missing. I mean, so one of the things I spent a whole summer in Paris looking for is that during the war, every single week, right? I know it was, like I said, I struggled
Sorry.
over it, right? Although it was one of those things where I only figured out where to go look the last week, just coming into August 1st. So, and Paris, you know what that means, right? That, everything shut up for 6 weeks just as you found the place to go look.
Right.
And know that during the war, the police kept a census of who was in every single hotel room in the Ritz every week during the war. And I ended up going to the Prefecture of Police and then ultimately going to the police archives there in Paris on the left bank. And though a lot of those records were destroyed after the war, because of course, if your name was on that list, there were only a couple of reasons why you would have been in the Ritz Hotel during the war, and they were either that you were a spy or you were a collaborator, and for personal reasons. So a lot of those files went missing. Number of Coco Chanel's files went missing at some point. So there were things that you definitely had filling gaps on.
Yeah. I didn't know that A Movable Feast is one of my great books that I love, and the movie sort of that plays off of that, A Midnight in Paris too. But I didn't know that Hemingway was a war correspondent to that effect, and not only that, that he sort of circumvented the law, the military law, to do it. And I have to tell you something interesting. There's a reporter here at the Los Angeles Times, an Armenian gentleman, Mike Krikorian, is a friend of mine, and he was sent to the Armenian Artsakh front lines, not say the front lines, but to the battle to document it just yesterday or 2 days ago. And so while he was preparing, I had sent him a text. He says, "Oh, I'm leaving tomorrow for Artsakh." I said, "You're going to be like the Hemingway of the liberation of Paris." And he sent back, he goes, "That's the most inspiring thing anybody ever sent to me." And the only reason I knew that was just finishing that part of the book. So I appreciate it makes it sound like I know what I'm talking about, you know. So I'm going to encourage the listeners to not only get the book, The Place Vendome, if you have anything to do with the World War II or Paris or anything after La Belle Epoque, just because it's a fascinating city and it's a fascinating story to hear what happened at the Ritz, and I really appreciate the energy it took to do this. But what was funny was, as I'm looking, Googling your name, trying to figure out, well, how can I get on my show, I see you own a winery. You own it in a particularly unusual place for, well, worldwide wine recognition of Vancouver Island isn't all that great.
Wild west of the wine world. Even wilder west than you all in California.
And then, we talked about what's happening in this industry. It's kind of whack, and you told me that COVID is wreaking havoc on tourism, of course, in Vancouver Island. So tell me, well, you're fascinated with champagne with your friends, and you write a book about Madame Clicquot. So now, what inspired you to decide that this was a good idea to get into the wine business?
Yeah, no. So there's always that aphorism, right, about how to make a small fortune in the wine industry, and it turns out it's not a very funny joke. And it's not really a joke.
No one believes me.
It's the truth. I mean, I know I learned the hard way on that one. I guess got to be said. I mean, ironically, I started out working in the wine industry, writing as a wine critic. And then I kind of ended up writing these women's biographies in the Second World War that followed without any logical sequence, and yet quite naturally from the Widow Clicquot, and then those earlier guidebooks that I had written to the wineries of Napa and Sonoma. And, at one point I was writing with Food and Wine. And so I started out in the wine world. That kind of moved me into Paris and luxury and the fashion world. And then that moved me into the Second World War. But at that point, when I was really focused on writing, I missed the wine industry. So we moved to Vancouver Island here in British Columbia, and I decided to go back and do the winemaking certificate program at the University of California, Davis. And that was a fabulous experience. I learned a ton. That's a 2-year program. It was a really wonderful experience. It is very much an experience in how to make, very commercially produced wine. And at that point, I ended up attending a raw wine festival in New York, met Isabelle Legeron and some of the other people involved with raw, and it kind of went from there, where I became interested in natural and raw wine. And then we bought a winery. That was a vineyard. That's how that all started.
Sounds like crickets.
That's my phone going off.
Oh, I know. Okay. I thought maybe I asked it.
That's pastoral scenery on Vancouver Island. That's crickets in the distance. Don't you all wish you could live in a pastoral serenity like this?
It sounds like I asked one of my famous questions, and that's all I got was crickets. So that's what I was thinking.
Well, now the crickets are gone. Now the sun is out.
I want to go back to the idea that you were a wine critic, because I know you wrote 2 guides. I think one was Napa and Sonoma. Is it the 2 guides? But when you got out of college you were writing as a wine critic? I mean, is this something that was just fun for you, or you thought this was a fascinating subject? This is before we started writing. It's just like, I'm a critic. I think I want to start to review wine.
Yeah, you know, my career is just one of like the sheerest dumb luck, right? I hold this out to all aspiring young people
That's
in the
great.
world. Right? Sheer dumb luck can get you all sorts of places. Now, it was really, I was a little bit older than that. I was probably almost 30 when I really started getting interested. I had moved to Seattle to do graduate school and became first interested there, but I got my first job at just before 30 in Oregon, as I mentioned. And, you know, there's just, Corvallis is a lovely place, but there's not a lot to do besides learn a mean game of croquet and learn a lot about Pinot Noir, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
So it really just kind of started as that passion that so many of us have for wine. And then later on, I wrote the Widow Clicquot, and then ultimately my ex-husband and I moved to Sonoma. And it was really just living in Sonoma County and driving around and thinking, even as somebody who is pretty experienced as a wine drinker for sure, you know, I felt intimidated at the idea of driving down one of those dusty back lanes and going and introducing myself to the winemaker. And I thought, you know, wouldn't it be great to have this guidebook that told you what was at the end of those roads? And so I pitched an idea to an editor in New York that I knew, and they took the 2-book series on it. And then we actually did do one later of upstate New York as well. And just in the process of that, I met so many amazing small winemakers, right? Because I interviewed them all. And at that point, you know, I mean, a whole series of doors opened, especially when the Widow Clicquot, we were lucky and ended up hitting the New York Times bestseller list. And that opened a lot of doors. So, yeah, one thing just kind of led to another. I am much more humble as a wine critic now that I also have been a winemaker.
Wow, that's a very interesting perspective. That's a really interesting perspective because it's not that easy. So what year do you think this was that you moved to Sonoma?
So we would have moved to Sonoma right around 2000.
Okay,
no,
so
it's not 2002. It would have been 2000, 2002. Yeah, I think it was.
So Oregon was the 90s sometime?
So, yeah, I would have been right around 2000. I was only in Oregon for a year. So that would have been 99, 2000. And then, you know, maybe 2 years in Wisconsin where I got the idea of the Widow Clicquot. And then we were in Sonoma until I got divorced, which was in 2008. So we were there 7 years or so.
Because Oregon, obviously Pinot Noir Chardonnay, some Pinot Gris, but we went to the second Pinot Noir festival at McMinnville College, 1989. I think 88 was the first year. You know, pretty much the wines were undrinkable. There were a couple of houses back then, like Bethel Heights and a couple other that had been making it for a little while and had learned. But they invited all the great Pinot Noir makers across the globe that went to the festival and exchanged ideas. And what happened, in my opinion, maybe I'm wrong, but what we, at least from a flavor profile and from a manufacturing standpoint, and I say this quite often on these podcasts, and that is, we used to say in this industry, that's very Burgundian. And I would get reps in here, you know, in the 90s, it's very Burgundian. It's like, we don't say that anymore. We don't try to be Burgundy. We try to be Santianez Pinot Noir. We try to be Willamette Valley. And so it's been fascinating to watch because they invited the French. They had Drouin there and Jadot, and all those people would come to this, and they were trying to be like Burgundy. And it's not Burgundy. It's Willamette Valley, and it's different. And now they've found their stride. The wines are gorgeous. They're world class. In fact, those same French winemakers have invested up there, bought property, making wines. They're making biodynamic wines at Louis Jadot. I think Drouin is too. So I found that transition slow but interesting. So you said something interesting about going back to school. Was it Davis you went back to?
Yeah, did the program at UC Davis.
Yeah, so this is an interesting thing, and I have this conversation many times, and I would say that not mostly, but many of the European winemakers I've talked to, you know, they're bootstrap winemakers. They started in the field, and they into the cellar rats, and then they become the head winemakers. It's not an uncommon story. Some stories are different in that they went to law school, or they went to get their master's in business, or whatever they did, and then they didn't like that, so they went to the wine business. And in your case, you decided to go back to school. Why didn't you go be a cellar rat and just sort of pound around the way to do it?
like starting at the top. Is that it, Paul?
Yeah, right. Something of that nature. Yes.
No, you know what it really was that we had already bought a vineyard by then. So
Oh, well, sure. Just
I
get
thought I
started.
had time to start at the bottom. I own the vineyard already. Yeah, we were looking for a house up here and ended up finding so we're on the Saanich Peninsula on Vancouver Island, which is a really interesting, very, very young, a very nascent wine industry up here. And we were looking at houses and we ended up finding this beautiful house that had palm trees and a pool and reminded me of California. I was feeling homesick for California. And it's in part that it also had a vineyard. So we ended up buying a house with a 1 acre vineyard that was maybe 10 years
Wow.
old.
Mm-hmm.
And you know how it is. You sit there on your deck and you think, oh, we have a vineyard.
Yeah.
We should have a
Mm-hmm.
wine. You have a couple of bottles of something nice. And suddenly you think, oh, yeah, we should do that. Because that thing about the small fortune in the wine industry, that won't be us.
Yes. There you go, thinking again.
Yeah, you're like, hey, I'm already in the small fortune, right? I got the vineyard.
Yeah. Oops.
So we started there, and then I really thought that if we were going to do that, then I would obviously need to make sure that I had the kinds of knowledge base that we would feel confident that, we'd made homemade wine before. My brother went to Goose Island, Goose River. My brother was a professional beer maker. I mean, I'd grown up in a context of, people who were engaged in fermentation. And from writing about it, I certainly understood that side of it. But I thought I'd better have the credential. And as I was saying, I think it actually is a very interesting experience to come at writing about wine and being a wine critic, having actually run a winery and having made wine and having done harvest and worked in fields and put manure down on fields. It's a very, very different perspective.
For sure, the perspective different, and that's well. First of all, what you said, the fermentation sciences are fascinating. My daughter's a baker. She actually comes home with starter. She puts it on the plane. She's got this cup full of yeast, bubbling over, and she puts it on the plane because it's her baby. She can't possibly leave it at home, So, but I wanted to touch on this subject that you're talking about at the university because I had an interesting conversation yesterday. I want to tell you about, and you were saying that when you went to school, you learned this commercial approach to winemaking, and does that mean the chemistry, obviously the chemistry of it all, but what did you mean by the commercial aspect of winemaking?
Yeah, I mean, basically and then again, I had a great experience at UC Davis, but basically what you learned is if you were a winemaker and the fruit comes in and the acidity level's too high, you can either do a single salt deacidification, or if you're really up the creek, you can do a double salt deacidification, and you can drop the acids so that you can make a wine that tastes just like the wine, that tastes like the wine that everybody expects your wine to taste like. So you can take fruit that has a whole set of variables and you can do a whole series of things to it based on organic chemistry. I mean, mostly it's acidity and pH, right?
Mm-hmm.
And change what you have to work with. You can change what came out of the vineyard so that you can make a product that has a kind of brand consistency, right? And also that prevents the risk of failure. So, how is it that you filter? How is it you fine? How is it you add sulfites? How do you inoculate yeast? How do you choose the yeast you want to inoculate with based on the profile you want? So I thought that was all hugely interesting to learn. But when the time came, I wanted to make sure we did it both hands tied behind our back, right?
Yeah.
So,
Well, but that's a huge subject today, and the conversation I had a couple of days ago with the woman that invented the aroma wheel, and she was all for it. Now she's a food scientist. I mean, that's what she studied, and so for her, it's perfectly normal. I mean, if we're gonna make potato chips taste like dill pickles, you can do that by adding some things, and that's not a problem. But with winemaking, particularly with the movement, and we're going to talk about raw wines in a second, that's different. And in fact, the argument goes on, or the discussion goes on, in that wine should be a representation of time and place, right? That's what it's for. And so as a consumer, you're destined to take what's been given to you by the vineyard effectively, right? The winemaker takes it, does what he or she can do with it to represent that, and then you drink it and say, this represents whatever. But there is another angle to that. There's another philosophy behind that, and much like why you drink Jack Daniels or Miller Lite because it always tastes the same. You know it's going to taste like that. And so there's two, I'm not going to say competing factions, but there's two methodologies out there. And I think one is more consumer oriented, right? One is like, yeah, I'm going to have this Miller Lite, tastes the same every time. That's why I'm drinking it.
Yeah.
But I think the real ethereal value of wine is not that. It's really about the sense of time and place. So why then, and what, and I've not, frankly, all of my years heard the term raw wine. What does that mean to you?
Yeah, so raw wine so it's actually a self-certification movement, right? So that was Isabelle Legeron, and her is a master of wine, and her group put together, because natural wine was getting thrown out there as a term and nobody really quite knew what it meant. They started a program known as raw wine, and raw wine is a self-certification, and they double check you by you send in a sample of your wine and they randomly run tests on it. But the lab tests to find out if someone's making, well, raw natural wine is pretty straightforward. So to us, and I try not to get involved in the, look, I mean, both wines are great. Like I have friends who make, in Napa Valley Cab or Hillside Cab, and, they do all of those kinds of processes on their wine, and it's great wine. Personally, the wine that we wanted to make was raw natural wine. And to us, what that means is that we farm regeneratively. So that means no pesticides, no herbicides, no fungicides, and no synthetic fertilizer, and we're no-till. So it's a carbon sequestration form of farming. Basically, it's pre-World War II farming, pre-industrial farming.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and the idea is that when you till the soil, the microbes that live in the soil are anaerobic, right? They live in the absence of oxygen. And when you turn it over, you're basically killing the microbiome, right? Every time you turn it over, you're also releasing carbon that's been sequestered. So for us, what we're really concerned with as farmers, first and foremost, is the idea of the microbial life in the soil, with the idea that is, and there's a lot of peer-reviewed science that shows that plants uptake nutrients naturally available in the soil depending on the microbes and the fungi available to them. So for us, it starts there. And also, we've got kids on the property, and I don't want to go spend my summer in August wearing a Tyvek suit blowing poison into the air. Kids can't go eat the dirt. Around. Right? The kids eat dirt. So, for us, it starts there. And then it means in the winery, we don't filter, we don't fine, we use only native yeast fermentations. We make our wines without any sulfur, with any sulfites added. And we don't deacidify. I mean, the biggest challenge that we have on Vancouver Island is that we get beautiful physiological ripeness because we're far north, and we get great solar radiation. So we always get full phenological development. But we're constantly struggling for sugars because our heat degree units are lower than they probably should be for us to really not struggle. That's why we're harvesting in October.
Yeah, well, I should see that. Okay, so boy, you've defined something new for me. There is, of course, there's biodynamic farming, and I learned about that through Dan Barber's book, The Third Plate, the Blue Hill Farms in New York, and what's happening under the soil. As they put it back in the book, there's a war going on down there, and I think that's huge value to the quality of food and wine. Absolutely, when it comes to the quality, it doesn't mean it's going to taste better. I think I've made that argument many times amongst organic foods that you see at the market that just don't taste that great, but that's all about the farming technique and the passion of the farmer. Yeah. So the biodynamic movement, which is, another step, which includes sort of the moon and gravitational pull and things. But the idea that, first of all, I can see why you don't have to add sulfite, because for one, sparkling wines, you can get away with it. Typically you can get away with it, not always, but you can. But what happens, and this is a devil's advocate question, you've got potential mold and mildew growing in the vineyard, and you're going to have to dust it with something, and what do you do?
Yep. So we do those. So we use baking soda, is the primary, our sprays. We publish all this on our website, right? Because we believe that actually farmers ought to be completely winemakers, need to do a better job on transparency, right? People need to actually say, for interested consumers, this is exactly what my farming practice is. So for us, we do an oil spray, horticultural oil spray. We use canola oil. We've just moved over to using organic canola oil. There's you can also use a petroleum-based organic product, but we prefer not to use petroleum-based. And we're able to get things sourced in Canada and canola, obviously. We use baking soda, and the effect of baking soda is that it lowers the pH. And so the fungus, especially powdery mildew, which for us, that and botrytis are the two risks, and highly susceptible, that lowers the pH so that the fungus can't live effectively. We'll use Castile soap. We use Dr. Bronner's as a sticker. We do use Cumulus, which is an organic product, which is basically a sulfur. We don't use the copper spray in a Bordeaux spray, but we do use elemental sulfur. And then actually in terms of the biodynamic, I mean, we are not full biodynamic. We don't go dance naked out into the sun and on the moon. We're not doing any of that.
Can't have everything.
It's a lot of fun, but we're a little too old for that now.
Yeah.
But one of the interesting things is we do use very much one of the biodynamic practices about burying, when you bury the horns. The reason that you bury the horns is actually it's a really, really great way of inoculating the soil with a series of anaerobic bacteria that are basically the same bacteria that's used in the commercial organic product Serenade, which is another one of the antifungal sprays. So interestingly, a lot of the big pharmaceutical companies that make things like Cumulus or Serenade, and Serenade's a bacterial, it's basically a probiotic. What they're doing is in fact patenting, certain things that in fact come out of the biodynamic movement. So for us, we do treat in that way. And you're exactly right about sulfites, right? That we had gone back in January, back in the days before COVID, we were in Rome at the very end until February. And probably even have had COVID because I was quite sick in Rome in January.
No.
Yeah, so I think I might have been
You're an international carrier.
I'm afraid I'm a little worried I was a super spreader all by myself unwittingly.
Wow.
But we were there, and I have to say I tasted a lot of raw natural wines in Rome and was not universally pleased, right? There were a lot of wines that I did think had acetic acid problems and that had Brett problems. And for us, we don't struggle with that problem because our pH and our acidity are almost always at levels where Brettanomyces and Acetobacter could not really take off in our wines. We don't have those problems, right? The challenge that we face as winemakers making natural wines in a cool climate, high acid, high phenological ripeness, low heat degree unit climate is we're always fighting acid. And I mean, our acids can be very, very muscular is what we like to call them.
Oh, good word. Wow. Well,
so we're fighting.
There's this movement in France, méthode naturelle sans ajout, something like that, some quelque chose. And it's kind of interesting to me. And I'm saying this from a commercial standpoint. Look, this is what I do every day. Every Tuesday, I'm tasting who knows how many wines. I tasted 100 wines 2 Tuesdays ago. And in the beginning, the reps come, this is natural. I'm like, what are you talking about now? So I started studying myself, and I found that, of course, that the USDA anyway has no definition, not even for natural wine, natural food, no less, except something like an opinion should be, well, we just think that what's not supposed to be in there isn't in there, and we'll call it natural. Right. So when you buy a bag of bagels that says natural on it, it doesn't mean anything. And certainly in wine is the same way. But the French had tried to do this. What was interesting to me is that they put, it took them 10 years to come up with this definition, and I'll explain it in a second. And they only give you 3 years to try it. And so I'm trying to figure out, okay, that doesn't seem very much time for a movement that's as strong as this one could be to test this idea. And their definition is much simpler. And it's hand harvested, no chemicals, no pesticides, organic farming basically, but hand harvested and then nothing added in the winery. And that's what they call, Vin Naturel, right?
And that's what I call raw wine. I mean, that would be,
Same thing. Okay. So, and I get, as I do with conventional wines, I get a huge spectrum. I get really bad things that people made, put in the bottle. Why? I don't know. And I get some very well-made wines, but I get the same discrepancy with natural and biodynamic. It's a wide range. And typically, the biodynamic stuff that's not, I don't know, even know what they have not done to it or what they did to it that makes it taste like and smell like horse manure, that's so raw and it's so, I don't even know what the word is. indigenous to where it came from, that it's not pleasant. And I still think, right, it should be pleasant to drink. You should want to drink it, and you should want to taste it. You should want to define it. You should want to have this with your friends. So that's you want that too, though, right? It's not just because you want to make raw wine, just because you want to make raw wine and have people enjoy it.
Brettanomyces a flaw, right? Like, I mean, that would be, I would consider, whether it was a conventionally produced wine or a natural wine, if you have Brettanomyces, I would consider that a flawed wine.
Right.
Or if you have acetic acid over a very, very, if you have VA over a very small level, I think that's a flaw. Yes. But at the same time, I think, wines that are, very over processed, or that have, yeasts that have been used in order to manipulate the taste, and the flavor profile, that have nothing to do with the place and are simply responding to a consumer demand. Right. I would also consider that a kind of mismatch that was a flaw in wine. And I think that's one of the things that, I've really, going back to this idea of like the humility that you get as a wine critic after having gone through the winemaking experience. For me, what that was, is that what I've learned is that there's well-made wine and there's not well-made wine. Right. That's and right. Those are objective categories. Like, there is a well-made wine and not well-made. There's a lot of well-made wine that I just personally don't like.
Yes.
And that doesn't mean it's like bad wine. It just means it's a well-made wine that I personally don't like. And that, I think, was the thing that knowing more about the winemaking side opened up that space for me. I would be very reluctant, to give points again, and it was never really my focus. I mean, I was always more of a descriptive wine writer anyhow, but I'd be very reluctant to do that because and I think Robert Parker would have said that, what he was judging was his palate, right? I mean, it's so subjectively driven in terms of the palate of the particular wine taster.
Like try and get my wife to drink Syrah, is that what you're trying to say? Because she won't.
It's sad just because it's Syrah, honey, right?
Well, people ask me what's your favorite wine all the time. I'm sure they do you too, to you as well. And so, and I do take a responsibility to try to avoid my personal preference towards a wine and judge them amongst each other. And that's the big difference between here and most places, or particularly like the Spectator or Parker or anybody else, is that we're not actually evaluating the wine for its some kind of score, which I think now is being completely bastardized, but we're tasting it against other ones of its category. So if I'm tasting a Mencia, from the north of Spain against other ones, I may not care for the grape that much, but I can certainly pick out the better one than the worst one. That's that's part of the tasting process. What do you think then? And you probably, since you're tied to the industry at the hip, the confusion out in the consumer world right now is huge. I mean, particularly with COVID and more online sales. I'm going to be on a show here in the near future. Part of this conversation is going to be what's happening to the consumer and how are they buying and what's changing. And I was just telling Jason here, what I was doing to sell wine in the beginning of COVID and what we were selling and people were like scooping it up is not working today. It's only been 3 months or 4 months. So the consumer's barraged with these messages: raw wine, natural wine, biodynamic wine, 15 wines for $45 on Groupon. I think it's time for consumer education in the form of things like Steven Spurrier's L'Académie de Vin or Les Amis de Vin or places like that. Has the education curve for your wines, the raw wine movement, been difficult?
Yeah, I would say for us, if I had been, partly we're in a monopoly province, right? So British Columbia makes 3-tier system in the United States look like a walk in the park.
Really? Oops. That's
terrible. Yeah, I know, it's hard to believe that, isn't it? Actually, you have that feeling, you're like, that can't be true. And I'm like, oh yeah, no, it's like Scandinavian. It's a monopoly province. So it is a very, very difficult market. It's hard for me to get my wines into the States. It's easier for me to get my wine into the States than it is for me to get my wine to Quebec, to Montreal. If I could get my wine to somewhere like Montreal, where, like Montreal is very, the consumer is very, very educated. But I think that's in part because the natural and raw wine movement, as you were saying, it has its kind of roots in both Burgundy and in Bordeaux, actually. One of the things that, we think of that movement as having begun is that people in Burgundy and Bordeaux realized that if you kept farming the way that they've been farming, there wouldn't be soil to pass on to the next generation in their family, right? That
That's
they would
right.
be the last generations to farm that land because you were stripping it. So, I think because of Montreal's kind of Franco forward looking, that consumer is very, very educated. I would say that on Vancouver Island, if we'd been, even if we'd been in the Vancouver market, Seattle market, San Francisco, San Diego, we'd have had a much, much easier time. Here, people are just beginning, I think, to understand what raw and natural wines are. And it's hard because there's a fair amount of, so for example, we release our sparkling wine in the ancestral method. So unriddled, right? And so people have to get used to the idea that yeast in your wine is not a flaw, right? And that's a pretty significant consumer challenge. And I think the other thing that we've seen during COVID that, is going to make what you're describing even more urgent is that there's just massive consolidation going on in the wine industry globally. I mean, Treasury, Constellation, brands and vineyards. I mean, we've had our first large Californian purchases of vineyards on Vancouver Island in the last.
Really? Wow. Real estate's going up.
So it's it's a good time to own a winery. It's just not ever a good time to be a farmer, right? So that is beginning. It's beginning to move up the coast. I think the pressure, with climate change, and I think in 20 years, Vancouver Island, the Saanich Peninsula, is going to have some really beautiful vineyard land. I mean, early on, there were mistakes made about planting the wrong varietals, right? So
that's
where we're at right now is pulling out the wrong varietals and starting again 20, 25 years in.
It's interesting because, Burgundy is feeling the climate change, and they're having to really wrestle with it since they're dry farmed anyway. And it's, how they're going to canopy and how they're going to trellis is going to be an important part of their future. And it's interesting to me because, they've been making wine since 1200, 1100, and the monks figured out, what the appellations were that were so great. I mean, how did they do that without any of the things we have today? Yeah. But that's my current fascination. Well, it's an interesting thing you said about Treasury and Constellation and Vintage Estates, those guys. I mean, this COVID thing, when we were in Napa not too long ago, we were interviewed by the Napa Valley Register thinking that they're going to do this glorious story on us and the history of the wine business, but it wasn't. It was more about, like, how can we get the Napa Valley wine companies, wineries into the 20th century and selling stuff. And this is probably like January of this year, so just before COVID. And she was talking about things like, well, we're learning how to use chat. And I'm like, well, if I don't have a chat button on my website, I'm not, it's like a lot of my sales come from chat. Okay. Right. So if the wineries haven't embraced that, so getting to the point that there's going to be a lot of wineries for sale coming up. I mean, people that are living on razor thin margins that are having difficulty now and that were relying on walk-in traffic, it's going to be really tough.
I predict COVID is going to take out 20% of the small winemakers. I don't think it's really hard. And I mentioned to you, we're closing our doors. We've decided, that we're not. The problem is that once the DTC, the direct to consumer market, falls apart, as a small producer, right, there's no way to recoup. I mean, we could not make a living on the wholesale margins, right? Those margins would simply not be possible. So for us, we're on an island, we're a tourist-based economy, wine tourism. Most people who are selling out of a tasting room, it's a tourist-based economy, and we're relying on DTC. And, if I were in a metropolitan area, maybe I could make up some of the DTC through local, free delivery and that kind of thing. But for us, we're a small island. I mean, we're a geographically large island, but we're a small population. And we're 2 hours from Vancouver by boat, right?
Yeah, so that's tough. You're not going to see anybody soon.
We're not going to see anybody soon. I mean, I think it'd be unlikely if tourism rebounds more in probably 3 years. There's kind of an optimistic outlook, I think, on that. And I think you'll find that, I haven't been, the borders closed, so I haven't been back down in the States in a while because I haven't wanted to do that quarantine to come back to Canada. But I know friends who have lost their vineyards in the fires.
That's sad.
And then, and it's awful, right? I mean, in beautiful vineyards, especially up on the hillsides above Napa, and those were small family productions. You're going to lose some people who are just not going to rebuild on that. I mean, I know that Napa Valley floor was already, people were already moving up the coast. I mean, that was already getting too hot, and you were just getting too high alcohols and too high sugars, so that the balance of the wine was getting skewed. And then COVID has just taken out, the model that most of the small producers were relying on. And so
It's
what
really
we're seeing
tough.
is our producers buying up. Yeah. So consolidation
I think that's what the movement. I think that's the next movement. It's just there's just too many choices right now, and I think I brought this up last time we spoke. But there's these, and I bring it up all the time in these podcasts, and my listeners are probably tired of hearing about it. But it's so important to see because these €1 per liter wines coming in from Europe, they land in New Jersey, they go to New York, they get bottled in a bunch of different names. They're all doctored up. They're just flavored up with whoever, and they're passing it off as wine. And that's not the experience that I want my consumers to have. I want them to hear the stories, understand these things that we're talking about today, to get the feeling for what wine really is about. And it is sort of sad to see that happen. It is sad to see it happen and to see these big companies just eventually gobble up these wineries to make just to make a buck. Yesterday I did a virtual tasting with a big group, and it was really a lot of fun. I had a ton of fun. We talked about the Judgment of Paris and all kinds of things. And I sent them a Napa Valley cab made by the Boisset Group, and I sent them a Murphy Good vineyard specific cab. Both of them great. And one of the guys says, and this is an important fact. One of the guys says, this 1881 Cabernet tastes like it's a mixture of grapes from all over the valley. Well, first I want to say, man, you must be really good. You must be really good if you can figure that out. But and it was like I don't know, maybe it was a $35 bottle of wine at $30. Yeah. And I wanted to say, well, sir, and he said it just a little bit arrogantly, like, you and I know this business now. It's an ongoing study of our life, really. It's a passion that you embrace, and that you can never run out of things to do and learn. And it changes like it just changed for you. So it's not about how much you know. It's about wanting to know. So I wanted to say, look, Cabernet last year in Napa was $8,000 a ton. Okay, that's like $200 a bottle. So if you think you're going to get Oakville Cabernet for $30, it's not going to happen. But that tells you the problem that Napa's having is that it's gotten so expensive, you can't produce a bottle of wine and sell it for less than $150. You don't make any money. So,
and yet I know people in the Okanagan who, there was that great article in the New York Times about Okanagan wine out of BC on the other side of the mountains. And what they were saying is, there are people who are having a hard time even when they get their wine across the border because the price point is so much lower that the consumer expectation is if it's not $100, it can't be fine wine.
That's right.
So there is all this weird consolidation in the market and it goes back to your point, I think, right? Because this consumer is not confident about trusting his or her judgment in whether this is a good wine or not. The consumer mostly isn't able to think, oh, well, this is a $35 bottle of wine that is a really beautifully made. That's a good wine. Somebody else might sell that for $100. And if you want to spend the $100, by all means, come to my winery. Let me set
got plenty
you up.
for you.
Any day. All I want is the people who want to pay 3 times what I retail my wine for, please, anytime, reach out. I'll reconsider my plan. But, that's the problem, right, is that so much of it ends up in branding. And that was really, for me, where I, started out being interested in the wine industry, both with the Widow Clicquot. And then also, the book I wrote after that, the other thing I had done at one point that taught me a lot about the wine industry is I had written a book after that about perfume, about Chanel No. 5 perfume.
Yes.
And had gone for a period to perfume school in New York at IFF. And I learned more there about wine because it's all just aldehydes and it's like all volatile aromatics and alcohol, right? It was a very, very interesting experience to understand how you can think about fine perfume and fine wine in using similar kinds of techniques. And usually the perfumers have a much, much more developed vocabulary actually for teaching people how to do that. We could learn a lot from them actually. If you're looking for a great interview, you got to reach out to a perfumer to talk about wine because
That's
it would be
interesting. Actually, what's interesting
great.
when I go to when I used to go to Nordstrom's or something, and I
Mhm.
would smell some of the men's cologne, and I would use some wine descriptors, and they would look at me like, "Wow, that was really good." I'm like, "Yeah, just
Exactly.
same thing, right?"
Yeah.
But that's interesting. You brought up Chanel number
Mhm.
5 because just going back to the book for a second, it seemed to me, based on what you wrote, that that perfume was almost barterable or almost a currency in itself at that time.
Yeah, it really was during the Second World War. I mean, it was
That's
cigarettes and
amazing.
silk stockings and Chanel number five, right? You
Yeah.
could buy anything on the black market with Chanel number five. And what I thought was really interesting, I mean, where that book started for me was thinking that about that question of, is this just marketing? Right? Is this just a marketing, or is there really something special about Chanel number five? And interestingly, the answer is, I mean, although the marketing certainly later on was brilliant, it actually really is. Every perfumer I've interviewed, including all of their competitors, say, it is really an amazing work of
Wow.
fragrance art, right? It's
Wow.
like a great wine. It's just a really, really beautiful perfume.
It's got to be about
Technically,
balance and weight and all the same sort of characteristics a wine would have.
exactly.
That is fascinating to understand about perfume. Um, well, this has been we were going on now. Even though we had some technical difficulties, we're approaching an hour, and we could probably talk further. And I might reserve the right to do that. But it's been
Delighted.
such a pleasure to have you on the show and peel some of this stuff back. And after I'm done, maybe reading Madame Clicquot or Widow Clicquot, I will re-engage you and start talking about those subjects
I'd
because
love to do that.
your
That's
writing is
great.
brilliant, and I think that I've already got one friend reading the Hotel in Place Vendome, so we'll keep promoting it.
All
And
right. Well, I
good luck up there
appreciate
with you
it.
harvested already, right? Is that what you said?
Harvest is in. Harvest is in just as of last week. Yes. So we're in the home stretch. We're all taking a deep breath, and the rains have just come. For us, it's always a fight against when the rains come.
Using
Um,
natural yeast and fermenting right now.
native ferment all the way. So we live dangerously up here. No, with those pHs, you're pretty safe,
It'll be
to be
good.
honest.
Tilar,
Yeah.
it's been a great pleasure. Thank you so much again. We hope to see
You're
you soon.
welcome.
And if you're ever in
Right.
Southern California soon, well, it won't be soon, but love to
I
tilt
hope
the
so.
glass with you.
Well, I'd like that too. Hope the border opens soon. Stay healthy out there.
Thank you. You too.
Take
Cheers.
care. Bye.